It was just an ordinary knock at the door. But for 7-year-old Jenn Carson and her mother Lynn, the men in black standing on their doorstep in 1982 would shatter everything they thought they knew about the world. The Secret Service had tracked them down, not because of anything they had done, but because of the men Jenn once called Daddy. The men who had braided her hair and baked her cakes. The men who was now the subject of an investigation for murder and a plot to assassinate the President of the United States. This is the chilling true story of a little girl who escaped her father's death cult. A story of survival, of confronting pure evil, and of a daughter who would ultimately help bring justice for the victims of the infamous San Francisco witch killers. In the beginning, life was idyllic. Jenn Carson was a daddy's girl in every sense of the word. Her father, Michael Bear Carson, then known as James Clifford Carson, was a brilliant man with a master's degree in Chinese studies. He was a stay-at-home dad who went to Grateful Dead concerts, made tie-dye shirts, braided Jenn's hair, and baked her cakes from scratch. In Jenn's young eyes, he was fun, loving, and attentive. But beneath the veneer of this California hippie family, something was very wrong. Michael's brilliant mind was beginning to show signs of unraveling. In 1978, Jenn's parents divorced. And then her father met a woman named Susan Barnes at a party, a meeting Jenn would later describe as gasoline and a match. Susan was a well-to-do divorcee from Scottsdale with 2 teenage children, but she had a dark and dominant personality. When Jenn visited her father after he moved in with Susan, the little girl was terrified by what she found. The house was filled with over 100 potted trees, no furniture, just a forest of plants. 4-year-old Jenn slept on the floor, surrounded by what felt like a haunted forest. But the real nightmare was yet to come. In her house of horrors, Susan would tell Jenn she was the devil. That she would go to hell. That she deserved to die. And she didn't feed her. Jenn remembers crawling into kitchen cabinets, desperately searching for food. Most terrifying of all, Jenn had flashbacks her entire life of Susan pushing her under bathwater, holding her down until she couldn't breathe. On one visit, Susan scratched Jenn's back so violently that she left 5 jagged nail marks, open wounds on a little girl's back. When Jenn came home from that visit with visible injuries, her mother Lynn knew she had to act. Michael and Susan had been trying to get a passport for Jenn. Lynn was convinced they were going to take her daughter and kill her. And so, she did the only thing she could. She packed up their lives and disappeared. They ran. They changed cities, states, jobs, everything. They were, for all intents and purposes, on the run from the men Jenn once adored. While Jenn and her mother were hiding, Michael and Susan Carson were descending into a madness that would claim innocent lives. They had become obsessed with extreme religious beliefs, fueled by daily use of LSD and other hallucinogenic drugs. They developed a twisted philosophy: they were on a divine mission to kill witches. And to them, anyone they didn't like was a witch. By 1981, when Jenn was 7 years old, the murder spree was already underway. The first known victim was 22-year-old Karen Barnes. She was killed in her own apartment in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. Michael bashed her over the head with a frying pan, then stabbed her more than 15 times. Police found her body in a pool of blood in her kitchen. The Carsons claimed Karen was a witch. Next came Clark Stevens, 26 years old. He was murdered and mutilated in Humboldt County. Then there was John Hellier, a 30-year-old man whose only mistake was being kind. He picked up Michael and Susan while they were hitchhiking in the Napa Valley. In broad daylight, with families driving by, the Carsons decided he was a witch and killed him. They stabbed and shot him on the side of the road. But the authorities believe there were more, perhaps as many as 12 victims across North America and Europe. The Carsons kept a list of targets, including celebrities and even President Ronald Reagan. For Michael and Susan, murder wasn't just a crime. It was a religious mission. It was 1982, and Jenn and her mother had been living in fear for years. They had moved to Southern California to get as far away from Michael and Susan as possible. Lynn had left her teaching job without a reference, taking low-paying under-the-table jobs to avoid creating a paper trail. They were ghosts, hiding from a monster. And then came the knock at the door. The men in black suits were from the Secret Service. They had tracked down Jenn and her mother because Michael Carson was under investigation for planning to assassinate President Ronald Reagan. The agents asked Lynn, "Has he ever threatened to kill a president? What are his political beliefs?" For Lynn, it was a nightmare come true. She had gone to authorities years earlier, begging them to believe her when she said these people were dangerous. She had told them they would kill someone. No one believed her. And now, the Secret Service standing in her doorway was confirmation she had never wanted. The agents revealed that Michael and Susan had narrowly avoided capture while living in a tent in the woods. They had been behaving so erratically that searchers looking for a lost hiker had taken notice. In their haste to flee, Michael had dropped a bag containing a gun and a detailed plan to kill the president. Jenn, who was sent to her room during the questioning, was 9 years old when the truth finally came out. Her mother sat her down and said the words that would change everything: "Daddy has gotten a lot worse. He is very, very sick, and he hurt a bunch of people, and they are not alive anymore." Those words set off an obsession in young Jenn Carson. She found newspaper clippings in her mother's dresser and began trying to sound out words like decapitate. She was trying to comprehend the incomprehensible. How could the hands that changed her diapers stab a young woman to death? How could the men who made her birthday cakes bash someone's head in with a frying pan? The psychological toll on little Jenn was devastating. She started sleeping with knives and scissors under her bed, convinced the world was dangerous and anyone could be a killer. If my father could kill, anyone could kill, she thought. By 9 years old, Jenn viewed every adult as a potential killer. The whole world terrified her. And perhaps most heartbreaking of all, she feared that she would grow up to kill people too. She worried she had inherited monster genes. She experienced vicarious trauma that was eating her alive. She suffered from debilitating depression, PTSD, and suicidal ideation. At just 9 years old, Jenn Carson wanted to die. She was a traumatized child, isolated, alone, and carrying a secret so dark it was destroying her. Jenn kept her father's crimes a secret for years. She felt shame, a corrosive shame that made her feel like she was the monster's daughter. As she later told People magazine, "I want people to understand that this type of shame is so corrosive. And that's why I tell my story." In 1983, Michael and Susan Carson were finally arrested. They demanded a press conference and promised to confess to their murders if their demands were met. And so, television crews across the nation gathered to hear the bizarre statements of the couple who would come to be known as the San Francisco Witch Killers. Michael stood at the microphone and rambled about evil as a powerful parasite that can only copy or feed off the light. Susan famously turned to him and said, "Now, Michael, we're only going to talk about the ones in California." They were bragging. They were proud. In 1984, they were convicted of the murder of Karen Barnes. Later, they would be convicted for the murders of Clark Stevens and John Hellier. Both were sentenced to 75 years to life in prison. But for Jenn Carson, the conviction of her father and stepmother wasn't the end of her nightmare. It was just the beginning of a lifetime of healing. Enter Michael Gonzalez. In 1984, Lynn met and married a man who would become Jenn's knight in shining armor. He was incredible, patient, and dedicated. He sought counseling for Jenn and signed her up for Girl Scouts and church choir. He put her on a regular schedule and gave her structure. He gave her hope. "He invested in me," Jenn says, "and I believe that's why I'm okay. I was a little kid with severe childhood onset post-trauma, severe depression, severe suicidal ideation. I was not doing well." With the help of her mother and stepfather, Jenn began to rebuild her life. She excelled in school and eventually earned a BA from Baylor University and a master's degree in counseling from George Washington University. She went on to earn her doctorate in social work. She turned her pain into purpose. Jenn Carson became a trauma expert, a suicide hotline manager, and a social worker. She dedicated her life to helping kids with emotional and mental health needs, kids just like she had been. But to truly heal, Jenn knew she had to face the men who had destroyed her childhood. When she was 19, she went to Folsom Prison to see her father for the first time since his arrest. It was a moment she would never forget. She looked into her father's eyes and saw something terrifying. It was like looking into the eyes of someone with no soul, she said. There was no remorse. No guilt. There was even bragging about the murders. And then something even more surreal happened. Eric Menendez, yes, the same Eric Menendez who, along with his brother Lyle, would later be convicted of murdering their parents, was in the visiting room that day. He got up from the person he was visiting, walked over to Michael Carson, and said, "Hi." Then he turned to Jenn, winked at her, and walked away. It was a moment that made Jenn feel like she was in the Twilight Zone. But it also solidified something in her. The man who was once her father was gone. In his place was a stranger, a monster, who had no connection to the little girl who once adored him. Jenn walked away that day and never looked back. She decided she would not let her father's crimes define who she was. She would transcend it. In her quest for healing, Jenn took an extraordinary step. She reached out to the families of her father's victims. She wanted to help them, to offer whatever solace she could, and to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for them. In 2015, Jenn joined forces with the families of Karen Barnes, Clark Stevens, and John Hellier to fight against her father's potential release. She stood beside them, saying, "I am not my father's legacy. I am my own person. And my father belongs in prison." Her advocacy has been instrumental in keeping the San Francisco witch killers behind bars. To this day, Michael and Susan Carson remain in prison, serving 75 years to life sentences. They will never be free again. Today, Dr. Jenn Carson is a beacon of hope for survivors of trauma. She is a writer, educator, speaker, and counselor who specializes in helping people overcome adversity. She shares her story with the world, not for sympathy, but to show that recovery is possible. "I want people to understand that this type of shame is so corrosive," she says. "And that's why I tell my story." She speaks about the vicarious trauma she experienced and how she transformed it into a life of service and advocacy. She works with children of prisoners, a population of nearly 1 in 40 kids in the United States. If someone is struggling today, get help because it can get better. It's okay to not be okay. And it's okay to get help because things can get better. The story of Jenn Carson is one of unimaginable trauma. She was a 9-year-old girl who discovered her father was a serial killer. She was a victim of abuse at the hands of a woman who tried to drown her. She was the child of a death cult, raised in fear and shame. But Jenn Carson is also a story of triumph. She escaped the clutches of evil. She faced her demons. She found healing. She became a voice for the voiceless and a champion for the marginalized. And in helping the families of her father's victims, she helped bring justice to the memory of those he killed. Jenn Carson avenged the victims, not with violence, but with truth. Not with hate, but with healing.